So what we'll be discussing, the differences between related food diagnosis. Yeah, that would be great. Differences in food-related diagnosis, the difference between an allergic reaction, sensitivity, and intolerances. Also, we'll be talking about the effect of inflammatory foods, how you respond to that, the typical signs and symptoms that can be associated with, and then we'll talk about, is it important to test, or should we be talking about eliminating? What's the correct direction that we want to go? And then how to correct damage from food intolerances. And we'll scroll down here. Perfect. So food-related diagnosis here. So this is when we get into more of like the disease-related conditions. So more commonly, the two big ones here are going to be celiac disease, obviously, which is with a gluten sensitivity, and typically diabetes, specifically type 2 diabetes, which is developed throughout life through basically sugar exposure or high glucose levels for chronic periods of time. We can talk about cardiovascular disease and other food-related topics that are a little bit more questionable, I would say. So I chose to pick these two, which are pretty concrete, and the evidence is pretty solid here that people who are having an immune reaction to gluten to the point where they're actually having structural damage. So a lot of people ask, well, if I have these certain markers, do I have celiac disease? And the true diagnosis of a celiac disease is to have a endoscopy and have a biopsy of tissue and have that tissue tested through what's called Marsh testing. You typically have 4 Marsh types, and actually what they found is that in Marsh type 1 and Marsh type 2, you can be diagnosed for celiac disease, and they've correlated that some of those people don't have overt celiac presentation, meaning like vomiting up food, bloody stool, some of the extreme celiac presentations. That's usually when you get into Marsh type 3 is when you have those types of extreme celiac presentations. But really the key here to understand is that we're having structural change. We'll talk about this in just a moment, but it's the microvilli, the tight junctions, your gap junctions are starting to break down. We're starting to develop crypt hyperplasia. So the analogy that I give is, here are your fingers, these are the microvilli, and in between are the crypts. So you can imagine, you can see your villi starting to become blunted, and they ends up in this where it almost looks like it's chopped down. And also in between my fingers, imagine the gaps being a lot larger and a lot deeper. So as you can see, where the villi would be, right next to that is your bloodstream. So now we have these large gaps for food getting into your bloodstream. I'm kind of getting in the pathology here, but just again, celiac disease, structural change. We no longer have this, we have this, and those spaces between my fingers are much wider. That's the presentation of celiac disease. But you can still have gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerances without having celiac disease. Ideal testing we talked about is the Marsh type, and then you can also do your genetic testing of HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ8, which is the genetic test for celiac disease. Type 2 diabetes, I think most people are familiar with this. Really what's happening here is that we now have a diagnosable disease to the point that your pancreas is burnt out. You've exposed your body and your bloodstream to so much glucose. So if you're not familiar, glucose comes in, we consume glucose, various forms, can be carbohydrates, sugar, even vegetables break down to glucose. And we expose the bloodstream to high levels of glucose for so long, the pancreas has to release insulin in response to that blood glucose. So it's kind of like basically just burning out your pancreas, saying, okay, we still have glucose, we still have glucose. We constantly have glucose in our blood. So the pancreas is saying, I constantly need to release insulin to lower that blood glucose. But it's like running a marathon. I can only run a marathon so long before I crash into the ground and I tap out and say I'm done. Same thing can happen with the pancreas, okay? What we measure to assess that, your typical measurements are going to be blood glucose, your insulin levels, hemoglobin A1C. You can measure your pancreatic enzymes to see if you have pancreatic insufficiency. Those are some aspects. You can get into autoimmune related diabetes. We won't get into that. That's a whole nother topic. But you can run markers that actually are assessing if you're making autoimmune markers to your pancreas. So that was the disease aspect of foods. Now we get into an allergic reaction. So what is an allergic reaction? Really, at its simplicity, it's an immune response that we're starting to upregulate your IgE, which is an immunoglobulin. So we have 5 immunoglobulins: your IgG, your IgA, your IgM, your IgE, and something that people don't realize, an IgD. That one's less understood, but that exists. And these can be stimulated in response to foods, in response to allergens, bacteria, parasites, things like that. These all can be stimulated. But with an allergic reaction, it is clinically diagnosed as an IgE response, an upregulation. And typically what we see here most commonly are like tree pollens, grass, weeds, molds, nuts, seeds, eggs, shellfish. These are just various allergens. And the common testing for an allergy testing is going to be your typical skin prick test for an IgE response. So basically what they do is they put some type of solution that's diluted, whether it be tree pollen, grass, various allergens. They prick the skin, and what typically happens is they are looking for a histamine response, which you can see that's circled on that boy there in red. You can see that large red wheel presentation, and that's a histamine response. So what typically happens is, we're going to come back to this histamine response, but what typically happens is we have an IgE response. That IgE then stimulates something called mast cells. Mast cells basically stimulate this red response, which is known as a histamine response. So just think about IgE. We have this mast cell activation that causes more blood flow. It causes, basically it's the initial trigger for your immune response to fight something. So without getting into the nitty gritty of it and the monotonous details, this is what happens when we have an allergic reaction. We have an IgE antibody that comes across a cytokine. It releases a mast cell, and then which releases a histamine response, is what you see in that red wheel presentation. Okay? So again, allergic reaction is just an upregulation of the immune system for an IgE response. Next, we get into now the food sensitivity. So you can see where we're going here. We talked about a food-related disease, a food driven by a disease. Then we talked about what is an allergic response. And remember, allergic response is that IgE response. And now we talk about a food sensitivity or an intolerance. They kind of go hand in hand. And what we have here is we have basically the inability for the body to break down a food, or we're lacking an enzyme to break down that food. And then what happens is we have food particles that are now larger than what they should be. And if any of those get into the bloodstream, will stimulate an IgG, IgM, an IgA response. Okay? And these typically, what we see typically is gluten, dairy, sugar, soy, corn, pork, and various nuts and seeds. The list can go a little bit longer than that, but the big culprits here: gluten, dairy, sugar, soy. Those are the big culprits. What happens in regards to this is making sure that we have good enzyme production, so we're breaking down effectively. And as we can see over here, I'll read this off a little bit because it's a little bit blurred here. This goes over the allergen and food intolerance part, so it kind of recaps what we said. Typically, an allergen is something where you're going to have this from childbirth. So it's something that doesn't really pop up out of nowhere. You know about this. Versus the intolerance, people can develop intolerances a little bit out of the blue. It's like, hey, I woke up today and I'm reacting to nuts for some reason. What's going on? So that's kind of one of the differences. Typically, an allergic reaction can have a response up to around 2 hours or less. A sensitivity or an intolerance can last up to 72 hours, maybe even longer than that. Literature shows even longer than that. And then here at the bottom, it's like, so don't be concerned with the foods because there's a lot of cross-reactivity, but those are really the big signs, between an allergic response and a food sensitivity. A lot of the times with an allergic response, you're going to have an anaphylactic response. So that means you'll notice it typically in the skin, the digestive tract, or the airways. You'll get bronchial constriction, you'll break out into hives or a red wheal, or you'll get overt, doubled over in pain, digestive complaints. You can get those with food sensitivities, but they're a lot more severe with the allergenic response. We'll talk about with sensitivities what some major symptoms are, but those can be a lot more broad, and they also can be, you'll notice what we'll talk about here is they'll affect the nervous system first, surprisingly, which people don't realize.
Which one?
The sensitivities. So next, I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible because I tend to nerd out and go a little overboard. So I'll try to keep this pretty clear. So we're going to go over the physiological response of inflammation. What looks like, what's going on internally. Because I kind of connect with this because I always like to know the how and the why, what's going on. And then I feel like I can always, if I know the how and why, I can somehow backtrack and rework those steps. So that's why it's really important for me. So we have inflammation, whether it be an allergen, a sensitivity, or maybe you do even have celiac disease. That will cause this extreme inflammation. So I always use the analogy of a sunburn. So, because people talk about a lot of times the food sensitivities, well, why do I notice like I have this food sensitivity that I'm allergic to? Like if I remove it from my diet and then they add it back in, they're like, whoa, I didn't realize I reacted to eggs this way. I didn't realize I reacted to peppers this way. Now when I add it back in, and this is the analogy I give, it's like a sunburn. So the first time you had it, it could have been 10 years ago. You have that initial response of that sunburn. It's hot, it's stinging, you don't want anyone touching it, even having clothes on it is irritating. And then eventually what happens is that sunburn starts to heal, but it still looks red, it still looks hot, but you can touch it and you're not as irritated. It's not as noticeable, it's not as tangible to you. Same thing happens in the digestive tract. We still introduce ourselves to that inflammatory response, that inflammatory food, but we're more accustomed to the symptoms that are associated with it. We're not as in tuned, basically. So that digestive tract can still be red and inflamed. It could still look irritating, but when we touch it, we don't notice as much of an irritation. That's kind of the analogy that I give. So we talked about this briefly. When we have that inflammatory food, we can start to have damage of the microvilli, or we can start to have damage of gap junctions. So like our intestines should be a wall between our bloodstream and our digestive tract. So we can start to have separation of that digestive wall. This isn't something where you have like one food and it occurs, unless you have like celiac disease, unless you have some extreme food reactions. This is something that happens over time. So this is something that you expose yourself continuously, and we start to get this breaking down of the microvilli effect, okay? So this is something that doesn't happen like that. As you can see here, I really like this picture. I've used it in a couple other videos. you can see the microvilli being blunted as inflammation occurs. And microvilli are really important for absorption of food. So really important for absorption. Also, they're really helpful because they release enzymes that can help break down food. So it's almost like it's a double whammy. We decrease our absorption, but we also decrease the effectiveness at which we release enzymes. Also, you can see that it releases, it's unclear here, but this end stage here, those purple rods there, that's gram-negative bacteria. So not only, to even add on top of it, a third whammy, not only are we decreasing our absorption, we're decreasing the enzymes, but also we're producing dysbiotic bacteria. So now we're shifting to more bad bacteria than good gut bacteria. So you can see how this can snowball very quickly, and we can kind of, go running in a very bad way quickly. So we basically, that kind of summed up talking about decreased absorption of nutrients, because we talked about the microvilli. And then we talked about leaky gut here, how those gap junctions start to open up, and we start getting food particles into the bloodstream. Okay. Now this is where we come back into the mast cell and histamine response. So as those food particles start to come in, and they're broken down in various responses. Maybe we break down a protein to a 2 amino acid chain, or maybe we break down a carbohydrate to a 3 or 4 carbohydrate chain. So the rate at which we break down our foods can affect what kind of stimulatory response we have in the immune system. So we have this release of food into the bloodstream, and we can produce this mast cell response. That's that hot hive response. What we miss the mark is we can heal the gut. So all of this is like basically, let's heal the gut. Let's make sure we have good digestive enzymes. But sometimes certain people who have I've healed my gut, I've done the enzymes, I've removed all the food, why am I still having issues? And we haven't quenched this mast cell response. So we can still have this mast cell response being activated and causing this inflammatory reaction internally. So it's important that we do address that mechanism, that's not still going out of hand, okay? Here's some other things. This is more into the autoimmunity. So if we continue with food sensitivities for long periods of time, we can have cross-reactivity and molecular mimicry. For a lack of better words, what happens here is when we get those food particles now in the bloodstream, these food particles can start looking like other tissue. So the immune system gets run down. The immune system says, I've had enough. We start to get fatigued. It's like I can't really, function as effectively as I first did. I'm just going to start killing everything because I need to protect you. And it says, this food particle could look a lot like thyroid. I'm going to attack both. I think everyone's heard of this analogy. So we can start actually ingesting food that get into our bloodstream and stimulate an autoimmune response to attack, whether it be your digestive lining in such like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, diverticulitis, or Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or Raynaud's, where you're attacking like your circulation, or Sjogren's, where we're attacking our connective tissue disease. Slap a name on it. It's just a name that is attacking that organ system. And then, so that basically covers that aspect. So to sum it up here, we have inflammation. We have damage in the microvilli. Once we have damage in the microvilli, we start having leaky gut, okay? If we have this for a long enough period of time, we'll start stimulating mast cell, we'll start stimulating cross-reactivity and molecular mimicry, and again, if that goes untreated for a long period of time, we'll start developing autoimmune conditions. Does that kind of make sense, that progression?
So the autoimmune condition could be like a Sjogren's or a... That's what you're saying?
Yes, those are all, yep. So some common symptoms here. as we all are aware of, when we get our typical allergic response, we're runny nose, we're tired, we don't want to get out of bed. But our common symptoms here: moodiness, sinus problems. I'll read it off because it's a little blurry. Moodiness, sinus problems, stomach pain, brain fog. I'll circle back to that. Food cravings, headaches, fatigue, joint pain, gas and bloating, acid reflux, acne, eczema, weight gain. If we let it go long enough, autoimmune conditions. So the reason why I starred brain fog. So a lot of people think that my first initial symptoms should be digestive complaints, to a food sensitivity, a food intolerance, even an allergen. For an allergen, yes, you'll probably exhibit, again, like we talked about, either the anaphylaxis from a bronchial constriction, hives from the skin, from the dermis, or a direct digestive complaint with an allergen. But the food sensitivities and the intolerances, the majority of the time, the first presentation might not be one of those three that we just talked about. And a lot of the times, it may be a neurological complaint. It may be a tremor that starts for no reason, an idiopathic tremor. It may be you notice you have increased anxiety or depression for some unexplained reason. It may be that in some severe cases that you actually have almost like hallucinations or auditory stimulations that aren't normal. So it can be presented in this fashion. The reason being is a lot of, mainly with gluten being, but a lot of them can interfere and interact with the neurotransmitters and some of the receptors in our brain. Hence, that's where the immune system kind of ties in there. Okay, so to test or eliminate, basically, my aspect is I want to be able to do as much as possible with the appropriate direction as much as possible. I'm trying to always think of my patients' investment in their health. So a lot of the times the testing can lead you down a rabbit hole, basically. So a lot of times it can lead you down a rabbit hole, and then you're doing a lot of, well, this says I can have this food, but I haven't. I noticed this reaction. That's a lot of times what happened, and it kind of just stretches out the progression of health. And my biggest thing is I want to get you quick as possible, even though we're dealing with chronic disease, and that's kind of like an oxymoron when it comes to chronic disease. But my goal is to get you as healthy as quick as possible. So typically what we do is we can do a Cyrex Array 10. That's kind of the gold standard in food intolerance and sensitivity. If you think you have an allergen, I would recommend doing a skin test and seeing if you do have a reaction to that. But if you're like, well, I just want to get some blood work and I want to get some testing done, Cyrex Array 10. Okay, you can do a 180 food or a 90 food test. This will test your IgMs, your IgGs. It tests amino acids. It tests peptides. It tests lectins. It tests various glucans that they actually use in like as food binders that you may be reacting to. It covers it all. It's very inclusive. So if I were to recommend something, that would be my recommendation. But typically, I'll let Erin kind of slide in here. She knows what I like to do and what we do as a whole here. So she'll kind of go over how we would manage that. But just so it's clear, I would rather eliminate, and unfortunately it's a little much of an elimination. I tell my patients who do report all of these sensitivities, we're going to put you in food prison for a period of time. I'm very upfront with you about it. It's not forever. It's not forever, at least that's our goal. It's not forever, but some people may find when they eliminate these foods and they bring them back on, it's that sunburn analogy that I talked about. I removed this food, I didn't have an issue before, but now when I add it back, I can't tolerate it. I notice I react to it. We removed that food. We removed that damaging food, so we remove the sunburn so we can allow it to heal. Now you add it back in, the sensitivity's there, and now you notice that sunburn more easily. So again, just to say, we prefer not to do Celiac array testing, but if you want it, we can do it. I prefer to go a little heavy-handed at first, so we're not going around in circles, and do an elimination diet. And I'll have Erin talk about that.
I have a quick question. If you have like a blood testing through an allergist, is that what that would be, that Celiac array test, or is this something?
Nope, that would not. It's
not
mainly,
the same thing,
no.
is it spoons?
Yeah, it depends. It depends. That's okay. It depends what. It depends the practitioner's methodology. It may be a allergist who's really on top of their game, and they may run a Celiac array 10, but a lot. It will be typically an IgE test. It's typically what they're going to run to make sure you don't have an allergic reaction and an anaphylactic response. They're doing their due diligence, because you come in and I'm the allergist. I want to make sure you don't walk out of my office and your throat seizes up, right? Which is absolutely doing their due diligence, but we also need to find out, well, what else is causing this. So it's a lot of times it's an IgE response. They're not really running IgMs or IgGs. You can get into other allergen testing. There's like a wide array. There's like tests that'll look at your cytokine response. I would try to stay away from that. This is a little bit more of your gold standard in regards to that.
How sensitive is it though?
So it is pretty darn good. So there's an investment to it, but it is it's proven through research. If you go on Celiac's website, they have a lot of literature backing their testing.
And the sensitivity can disappear?
Can the sensitivity? Absolutely. And we're going to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'll let Erin talk about some of that aspect.
Okay. So Dr. Ross talked about what we often like to start with patients when we're looking at possible food sensitivities and multiple food sensitivities is using something called the Autoimmune Paleo template. And while he said, yes, this is an aggressive and kind of can feel restricting at the beginning, we notice a lot of people right away when you remove those big allergens that are causing that constant inflammation, whether it's in the gut or wherever you're feeling that symptom neurologically in your joints with pain, patients notice right away that they start to feel better because it decreases inflammation pretty quickly. So the reason we like to use Autoimmune Paleo template is basically it's taking a paleo template but also removing some of those other big allergens. So we're looking at the diet consisting of high quality proteins, high quality fats, vegetables, and fruits. And that's really where we're getting that's what the diet consists of. What it is also, what it's going to remove is gluten, those big ones that Dr. Ross talked about at the beginning. Gluten, dairy, soy, corn. Those are the big ones that it removes. It also removes sugar. Sugar is an automatic inflammatory food.
All forms of sugar?
Mm-hmm. Initially. So when we talk initially, we're looking at removing all of those for a 6-week period. So when we look at an elimination diet, we're removing those for 6 weeks. And that's important because what it's doing, it's allowing, when you have that constant inflammation, it's allowing the body a chance to heal. So it allows those levels of inflammation to come down. And what we're doing is we're providing the most nutrient-dense food that you can bring in that isn't going to continue causing that inflammation. So it allows things to calm down, and it also allows you to start absorbing as healing happens. After that 6-week period, that's when we can look at strategically adding foods back in to kind of see how you respond, like Dr. Ross talked about with that sunburn. It really gives the patients a lot of feedback. Their body is basically going to communicate What is the food that is bothering me? So I have another sunburn allergy that's just a teeny bit different than Dr. Ross's, the way that I like to use it. If you picture when you have sunburn and your skin is really sunburned, any fabric that you put on, even if it's like a silk blouse, that's going to be irritating, right? It's it's annoying. So once that skin heals, just like when we can allow let inflammation to come down, healing to happen within the gut, those tight junctures come back together and heal. Then when you put silk back on, for most people, that isn't irritating typically. Cotton feels fine, but wool is an aggravating fabric on healthy skin or sunburned skin. So there are some foods that we see that really are never healthy to add back in. Gluten's a big one. Gluten tends to be a huge irritant. It's a hard protein to digest. But some people find eggs, they can tolerate eggs after they go through that period of healing. When they add it back in, they may tolerate, especially high quality, eggs that come from chickens that were pastured, that are highly nutrient dense. So I forgot to add that. Autoimmune paleo is also removing eggs during that first 6 week. So did I miss any, Dr. Ross?
Eggs,
Trying to think.
Nuts, seeds, nightshades, which are tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and potatoes, if I said that.
Yeah, so they contain selenium, which can be inflammatory to an already inflamed system as well. Okay, so I have some resources here. It's actually a packet that I often will hand out, give to patients if they're going to be starting the autoimmune paleo template. So it really does a really nice job of explaining the why, the how, the what, and then just is packed with resources as far as you can leave thinking, well, what do I eat? There's a ton to eat. It just takes education, planning. Planning is a really key piece to that, so you're set up for success. The worst thing is when you're starving and you don't know what to eat. So that's really where, that's my job in the process of helping to educate, answer questions, and then provide resources. So, if this is something that feels easy to implement then, okay? So strategic, I'm just gonna jump down to this one and then I'll come back to FODMAPs. When we look at strategically adding foods back in a systematic fashion, we do have a strategy to it. So it's not just haphazard, because that can also feel really confusing. It's also really hard to tell, to really understand symptoms. Like Dr. Ross had shared in the beginning with this, IgM and IgG, these are not immediate allergic responses typically. They're happening over a 24-hour period to a 72-hour period. So when you're starting to add foods back in, and you're not giving yourself enough time to really feel the response, it can become really confusing. And also those symptoms aren't always as straightforward. They can present as, something on the skin, eczema. It can present as indigestion. It can present as a lot of those symptoms that a lot of us tend to live with for a lot of our life that feel normal, but they can be hard to really connect maybe to one specific thing we're eating. So the autoimmune paleo allows us that structure to really remove, feel better, find some healing, and then strategically add things back in. So we like to add, one food back in at a time over a course of 4 days. See how you feel. If you continue to feel well, then we strategically go to the next food. So there's a lot of strategy, and that's why it's very helpful. And our patients find a lot of healing and insight into what's going on in their body. Okay? So we also listed FODMAPs. Have you heard of FODMAPs? Yep. So I'm going to do my best here. They are foods they're called fructo-oleosaccharides. Thank you, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. They are long-chain carbohydrates that can be very difficult for some systems to digest. So sometimes we do help patients, depending on what's going on, we would advise that to remove FODMAPs from the diet for a time, allow for healing again, and then slowly introduce them back and see how you're doing. Some high FODMAP foods, gluten is a high FODMAP food, onions, garlic. So, some people don't digest them well, and that's why if you've ever heard someone say, I have an allergy to onions or garlic, it's a high FODMAP food. So that's another type of food that we might advise to use in an elimination diet as well. Okay. All right. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Great job.
Oh, well, thank you.
Okay.
All right, we're going to pass our little teeny mic back.
Yeah. Let me get that. Okay, perfect. So that was great. Thank you, Erin, for that. So the things that I would just want to add that I think that will be beneficial is I think that's a great reminder for the 72-hour. Because a lot of the times patients will report like, well, I don't notice anything. And then immediately, like, I had this food, I was fine. I didn't have any digestive complaints. I didn't notice any skin issues. I shouldn't react to it, right? Well, again, we can have that 72-hour response. And remember how we talked about IgM and IgG immunoglobulins. Well, it can take up to 8 days for that IgM immunoglobulin to break down, and up to 21 days for the IgG antibody to break down. So we can have those circulating antibodies technically on the IgG aspect up to 21 days. That's not necessarily meaning that you're going to exhibit for all 21 days that symptom. We might be able to degrade that antigenic load enough, or that antigen antibody load enough that you no longer experience those symptoms. But it's just to drive the point home that you don't have to have an immediate reaction to exhibit a food sensitivity or intolerance. And the other thing here that I wanted to comment is that when we add foods back in, we want to think about the aspect of a dose-dependent response. So what that means is it's pretty simple. The more of that food I try at that exposure, the more likely I have a reaction. So typically what we do is over that 3 to 4 day period of reintroduction for a single food, I typically want my patients to start with a small dose, whether it be a handful or just a bite, even for that day. And as you progress through that reintroduction, we increase that dose-dependent response. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, I think that was it. That was great. And then with the AIP, like a lot of the times, a lot of practitioners have told me to focus on this, which I really think is important. Let's not focus on what we can't have. Let's focus on what we can have. So really, Doc T talks about it all the time. He'll just spurt it out real quick. He'll say, what we can eat: meats, meats, veggies, fruits. You can do, I'm blanking on sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes, all plenty of healthy fats. So he blurts out real quick. So meats, veggies, fruits, sweet potato, healthy fats. Coconut oil, avocado oil.
How important is it to do organic or grass?
Yeah, and another great point. The analogy you are, so in conventional cattle raising, their goal is let's get them fat as quick as possible, but let's also make sure we don't lose our profit so they don't die on us. How they do that is they feed them GMO corn, they load them with hormones so it fattens them up quickly, and then they pump them with antibiotics so they don't die on them, so they don't lose their profit. And typically, the analogy, you are what you eat. So, and this is in the form of when we're talking about meat here, Cows, which is our main meat consumption, are ruminants. I believe bison are as well. I'd have to, don't hold me to like lamb. I'm not 100% sure. They are ruminants. So they're ruminants as well, which means they have multiple stomachs. They have stomachs that are specifically like their own each chamber for certain phases of digestion when it comes to eating grass. I'm assuming the majority of grazing animals that feed off grass fall in the category of ruminants. Yep, exactly. So that just ties together. They're meant to eat grass. They literally have this mechanism of digestion for multiple stomachs to consume that food. But instead what we do is we load them up with antibiotics, feed them genetically modified corn, and load them up with steroids so they get fat quickly and stay alive long enough to slaughter them. In the aspects of chicken, and they're not allowed to to graze freely. So really important getting free range, low or no antibiotics, and typically when you see them in their chicken coops, they're kind of kept in a tight environment and kind of living in their own excrement. So, the analogy, Tara, our IV nurse, she always talks about a happy animal provides happy food. And I totally agree with that. So that's the aspect when we're talking about organically raised, free range food is, making sure that they're grass fed, they're eating what they were meant to put on this earth to eat, and that they're not being injected or poked, prodded, and stimulated. I think that's it. So we're going to move down to the next one. Last one here. We're just going to give you a little bit of information additionally. So a lot of people are aware of this, the 4 R's. I like to throw another R in there, but it's kind of tied in. So first, what we want to do is we want to remove the inflammatory food. So we've talked about that already, going to the point of AIP, FODMAP, removing that food. Okay, really important that we remove that inflammatory response so we're no longer stimulating that cascade that I discussed earlier. Then we want to replace. So now it's talking about adding in healthy foods. I would even go to the point of replacing with enzymes here. So this is where we want to start enhancing digestive function, and we start wanting to improve the way we break down food and absorb food. Okay, so enzymes. You can do your hydrochloric acid or betaine. You can also do Swedish bitters. These are all things that improve hydrochloric acid and enzyme production. I won't get into digestive because that could be a whole nother hour, but HCl is so crucial to your digestion. HCl is the stomach acid, stimulates all other actions. It's basically one of the first cascades in digestion. With remove, I would probably at this phase, with removing food, also talk about using maybe possible binders such as bentonite clay, diatomaceous earth, other things that will bind these toxins and remove them, or stimulating liver detox as well. That could be something that could be thrown into there, but should be evaluated, not just kind of haphazardly gone into. So we talked about our remove and replace, then we talk about our repair. So now we're at the point where we want to take our villi that have been trimmed and start to repair those villi, start to repair the crypts, the crypt hyperplasia, start repair the gap junctions. The way we do that is a lot of good amino acids, one being glutamine. That's very helpful in repairing the stomach. Deglycerized licorice helps to kind of coat and calm the stomach because a lot of the times there's a lot of either acid reflux or just a lot of issues with the digestive function, so it allows that process to go a little bit smoother. We can do golden seal, other herbs and natural remedies to help repair that digestive tract. Increasing your butyrate is also helpful. So short chain fatty acids help to repair and grow those microvilli. So that's another aspect. You can do like marshmallow extract. That's another aspect that kind of coats and seals and soothes the digestive function. And now we rebalance. So we rebalance, or I call reinoculate. So we add good probiotics back in at this time. We start to shift your microbiome so you have more eubiosis, which is a balance of good and bad bacteria, because there's probably going to be some, it's impossible to 100% get rid of all bad bacteria, but we start to reinoculate with more healthy bacteria. And then we can also increase healthy bacteria by what we eat. We add, good probiotic foods, whether it be kombucha, whether it be sauerkraut. If you're daring enough to go into the Chinese fermented foods, you can do meat, you can do miso, you can do kimchi, you can do natto. I meant natto, not miso. So you can do kimchi, you can do natto, you can do those are the big ones that you can do from the Chinese perspective. Or maybe I'm speaking interactively. I think they might be Chinese or Japanese. I don't want to. Or Korean, yeah. So those would be the big ones from a food standpoint that you could consume to help your digestive function. And that would basically be it. And then if I could add another aspect in here, if you're still struggling, looking into the mast cell activation, that can be a whole topic on its own. But getting markers to see if you are driving mast cell activation, and then implementing strategies to downregulate. That's if you're in that response, or you're in that category, I would not recommend taking care of that on your own. That's a little bit bigger of a fish to fry. So there's things that we can do where you can add certain medications, or you can implement certain supplements that will help to downregulate the histamine response and the mast cell response. Some of the times those can be like nettle or quercetin. Those are the big ones. But there's some other aspects that we can do that influence the brain and the digestive tract. But again, if you're someone that is kind of reporting of that, I would not recommend taking that on your own. That's it.